This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome members and officers here at City Hall and the public in the gallery or watching on the webcast to today's meeting of the GLA Oversight Committee. Please may I remind participants to turn your phones off or put them on silent, and can I also ask members to ensure any electronic devices are not placed in front of the microphones. Can I ask the clerk, Nicoletta Kemp, to confirm any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Jubal, for whom Assembly Member Mwema is substituting. We've also received apologies from Dr. Onka Sahota, for whom Assembly Member Desai will be substituting when he arrives to the meeting. And we've received apologies for lateness from Assembly Member McCartney. Thank you.
Thank you. Declarations of interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members?
Noted.
Thank you. And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee on the 14th of December 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. And on to summary list of actions, can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the GLA Oversight Committee?
Noted.
Thank you. And action taken under delegated authority, can we note the recent action taken under delegated authority by me as chairman in consultation with group leads to agree the report on devolution in London as attached at Appendix 1, and note the recent action taken by the Chair of the London Assembly in consultation with the Deputy Chair of the Assembly and party group leaders to agree the London Assembly Annual Report for 22-23 as attached at Appendix 2. Thank you. Yes, and it's finally out there, and it was a great report, so thank you. Right, monitoring officers' updated responses to the governance of trade missions and the GLA Code of Conduct report. Can we note the updated responses from the GLA monitoring officer to the committee's report on governance of trade missions and the GLA Code of Conduct as attached at Appendix 1? Thanks very much, and thank you, John, for waiting patiently whilst we dealt with the business there. On to our main item of business. We have a Q&A with John Preston on the London Pensions Authority. I'd like to welcome John, who is the chair of the LPFA, who's joined us for the chamber for the discussion. So, John, if I could just kick off firstly with your take on the LPFA's performance over the last 3 years.
If I may, Chair, I'll actually deal with 4 years rather than 3 for 2 main reasons. Firstly, because 4 years happens to be the exact period of my chairmanship, and I'm not exactly sure I can cover what's 3 and 4 years. But secondly, because we have to recognise that COVID did happen during that period, and it has had a fairly significant impact on what we've done. I think I'd start by saying that the first thing, and the most significant thing in many ways we've done, is to bring a significant number of activities back in-house. Just very brief bit of history for those Assembly members that weren't around at the time.
Could I request that you bring your microphone perhaps a little further towards you? Thank you so much. I'm just...
Is that better?
That's so
I'm
much
so sorry.
better.
I didn't realise you couldn't hear me.
Thank you so much. That's very kind.
So I was just saying the first thing that I'd mention is that we brought a significant number of activities back in-house. Brief history. In 2016, when we entered into the joint venture, which became the Local Pensions Partnership, at the time, the decision was taken for very good reasons to outsource everything that the LPFA did, including all of our back office functions, finance, HR, and so forth. With 4 years of experience by 2020, we realised, with the benefit of hindsight, that that was probably a mistake. 2 reasons for that. The first is that this was never going to be a key part of LPP's business. They were doing it for us, but it wasn't something that they wanted to invest in. It wasn't part of their activities. And therefore, it became comparatively expensive for us to do it that way. And secondly, because it wasn't a key part of their business, it wasn't something that they were going to invest in and allow us to improve the services that we wanted to provide to our stakeholders and our members. Accordingly, over the last 4 years, we've been gradually bringing back in-house a number of these activities. I'm comfortable that pound for pound we're saving money by doing that, but it's also given us the opportunity to improve the services that we offer. An example would be services we offer to our employers, for example. And that's had a fairly significant impact on the way in which we've been able to do things, and I think that's been very positive. I think we've looked very significantly at the governance of the organisation in a number of different ways. The first one is that we've improved the governance and oversight that we have over the Local Pensions Partnership, which runs both our investments and our administration for us. That's been quite a lengthy process, but I'm very pleased to say that we've got there, and that's an enhancement. We've enhanced the internal governance of the LPFA. I'm sure there'll be further questions later about transparency and so forth, but we have tried hard to become more transparent. We've got a way to go on that, but we think we've made progress. We've enhanced the oversight arrangements. For example, we converted our investment panel into a formal committee of the board, the investment committee, and a number of other aspects which I'm sure we'll come back to. I think we've improved the diversity of the board. I think our board is much more diverse in a number of ways than it was several years ago, and I'm very proud of that. I think we've made very real progress on responsible investment in general and addressing the climate change emergency in particular, and we're very proud of some of those. And again, I'm sure we'll come back to some of those issues later on. I think we've launched the London Fund. I'd love to claim full credit for that, but it was actually started by my predecessor, but nonetheless, we've proceeded with it. We were delighted to hear only last week that another 2 London boroughs are actually going to invest in the London Fund, so that will bring the total number, including us, up to 4. Still less than we'd hoped for at this stage, but nonetheless, it shows momentum, and we're really, really pleased with that as a project. In terms of the investment in the administration businesses, we've supported our administration business, LPPA, in the very difficult but we agreed necessary decision to change their computer administration system. That's had a number of implications, which again I'm sure we'll come back to. But I'm very pleased to say that we're coming towards the end of the process of bringing that up to speed, and we're going to start seeing the benefit of that over the course of the next year or so. We've supported
Okay, sorry.
Should I just switch my, can I just move them?
Yeah, you can indeed. Apologies, I seem to be hearing you clearly, but it must be my back like ears. Yeah.
Musical chairs.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Well, let's give it a go.
How about that? Is that better? Okay. Please do say it. Sorry, it's very difficult to tell this side of the table that you can't hear properly. So I was just saying about LPPA, and we supported them in their difficult decision to press it back just a little bit. Is that better? In their difficult decision to change their administration systems. That has produced some challenges, but I'm pleased to say I think we're coming towards the end of those, and we should expect to see the benefits of that new system come through over the course of the next 12 months. We continue to invest and support in LPPI, our investment business. We were delighted that the total savings that LPPI have realised in investment management fees since pooling began is about £153 million. And that's about 30% of the total savings that have been realised by the whole of pooling, even though we only make up about 6% of the total assets of the pool, so we're very pleased with that. I'd love to claim credit for the investment performance itself, which has been good, but of course that's an outsourced function that we delegate to them, but nonetheless we're pleased with that performance. Very difficult to measure, but I think we've significantly changed the external perception of the LPFA. This was something that started under my predecessor as chair, but I think we've made real progress of that. I think there was a perception many years ago that the LPFA was a rather distant and perhaps somewhat arrogant organisation in the way in which we dealt with people. We've been very keen to try and change that image and to demonstrate that we believe passionately in collaboration, in working with other funds, in working with other members of the LGPS, collaborating internationally. You know, we are seen and we're cited as being a key member of the C40 initiative, for example, and we collaborate in a number of these sorts of initiatives, and we think that's very important. We're very keen to see and continue to explore if there are other ways in which we can work with other funds within the LGPS to try and improve efficiencies and enhance the overall structure of what we do. I think we've gone quite some way. I think we're still working on it, but we've gone quite some way in enhancing our communications and the way in which we communicate with all of our stakeholders, and it's something we're keen to continue to do. And I suppose finally, I would just say that we regard ourselves proudly as an output-based organisation. In other words, we have a team, we have a comparatively small team, but because we focus on actually generating outputs, we feel that actually we punch perhaps slightly above our weight in terms of what we manage to produce and get out there. So I'm sorry, that was a relatively long list, but I hope that gives a number of hooks that we can follow up on over the course of the session.
Thank you. I hate to focus on the microphone when we're talking about something so interesting, but I was picking up that it was happening again then. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone's got a hotspot on, or John, if you've got a hotspot on your phone.
My phone's off, I think.
Oh.
I don't think it's the mic.
Yeah, it's the hot. Apparently, it's the hotspot. So I don't know. So. Yeah.
You just say it's the hotspot every time.
I know. Okay, but dare I say it was better towards the end of when you were speaking. So let's just hope.
I'll try and sit back.
May I suggest if members can turn their phones off, then that might help. But if I know some people can't, but.
Thank you.
Well, only if you want me to pass out halfway through with nothing.
Right. Apologies, John. Moving on. So that was a really nice speedy canter through some of the key achievements there and some of the concerns. I wonder if you can delve a little deeper into some of the specific areas of concerns that you think are affecting the LPFA's performance at the moment.
Well, I probably should start by saying that there's nothing, and I don't in any way want to sound cavalier about this, but there's nothing out there that is fundamentally keeping us awake at night, if you see what I mean, in terms of concerns. There are a number of priorities which we might come back to as to the things we're focusing on going forward. But almost certainly the most significant issue that we've been focusing on over the last year is the performance of our administrators, LPPA. They, as I say, introduced a new computer system for very good reasons, and we were very supportive of that just over a year ago. They had to, for a variety of reasons outside of their control, implement that handover in a 1-year period, whereas normally you would expect to do something like that in a 2-year period. And that inevitably put even greater pressure on what would otherwise have been a fairly significant transition anyway. We acknowledged right up front that that was going to involve some reduction in service. We recognised that that was not desirable, but it was in the long-term interests of our members. We did see some reduction in services, and therefore over the course of the last year we've been spending quite a lot of our oversight time in trying to work with LPPA to address those challenges and improve those areas of concern. I'm very pleased to say that although I haven't seen the final figures yet, the flash numbers I saw for November and December suggested that actually we are now back to achieving the desired service level agreement figures, and that actually complaints are falling, or they're getting back to much more manageable levels. So I don't want to declare victory yet, but I'm very pleased with where we've got to. Happy to go into more detail about that. But crucially, we think that there are now, because we've stabilised things, we're now in a position to start getting the benefits of this new computer system, and actually we'll start to see enhancements to the service rather than just get back to where we wanted to be.
Thanks. And we saw in the audit published yesterday that there was two of the issues were brought up were, probably to coin your phrase, not things that might keep you up at night, but they raised the insufficient review of the pension administration strategy and a lack of succession planning. Were those things that have been on your radar before, and have you got plans in place or plans in progress to look to resolve those concerns?
Yes, I mean, very much so. So firstly, the pension administration strategy is now done. I mean, that was finished before the end of 2023. It was a review of a system that we hadn't reviewed since 2014, and we've done that, and that's published. Succession planning, we are continuing to work on. It's always going to be a challenge for an organisation like ours. I mean, we only have a team of 24 people. So frankly, inevitably in an organisation like that, there is going to be an element of key man risk that we need to worry about. You know, I make no secret of the fact, you know, if our chief executive fell under the, heaven forbid, proverbial bus tomorrow, he would be a very difficult man to replace. That's not, as I'm sure you appreciate, uncommon for an organisation of our size. But we have done a lot of work to try and mitigate that. We're just about to launch a search for a chief operating officer, which will go some way to mitigating, you know, that particular key man risk. We've done a lot of work on strengthening our governance arrangements with a senior legal officer, a governance manager, and so forth, to try and make sure that some of those issues aren't there. But if I may, just on the internal audit report, firstly, I apologise that only came to you yesterday, and you know, you requested it last week. Genuinely, that was a misunderstanding. I was on holiday last week. I was under the impression it had been sent to you. I only discovered yesterday it hadn't, which is why it came to you so late. I'm very sorry for that. But you'll have seen that we've moved significantly to sort of reasonable assurance. But I think it probably is important, particularly in the context of last year, to make the observation about how we see those internal control reports. As I'm sure a number of members of the Assembly will appreciate, this is not like an external audit where somebody is trying to provide assurance to external stakeholders that there is nothing that's actually gone wrong. We see the internal control report the way it's intended to be. This is a document which is commissioned by management to help us. This is about saying, as an organisation, you have a variety of controls which are designed to make sure that things can't go wrong. If they're not working 100%, it doesn't mean to say that anything is going wrong. It just means that the systems can't make sure that they don't go wrong. And therefore we see these things as constructive and helpful, and an opportunity to say, okay, well, this is an area where our controls aren't working as well as we'd like them to, and therefore, you know, we see this as, thank you, we can now move on and try and get to where we want to. You'll appreciate, for many organisations, the internal control and internal audit functions are actually internal to the organisation, as the name suggests, and therefore they would be produced by people who are actually employed by the organisation. We don't have the resources to do that, so we outsource it to PwC. It's a slightly odd concept of an outsourced internal audit function, but that's what we do. Even if this was done by people who are employed by us, the wording of an internal audit report is standard, and therefore it would be phrased exactly the same way, even if these people were phrased by us. So we're very encouraged by this. We think we're making progress, sort of what we would expect as you build up an organisation from scratch. We went from literally a chief executive and a secretary to a team of 24 people. We're building our systems, and we're quite encouraged now with the way in which that's going.
Thank you. And if you could turn perhaps to investments now and talk us through how the current economic climate is affecting investments and ability to invest.
I mean, obviously, we are long-term investors, so we do have the luxury, which even many pension funds don't have, of really being able to take a long-term view of where we're going. So we set, although we've outsourced the management of our investments to LPPI, we set the strategic asset allocation based on advice we receive. And we believe that we have an asset allocation and a set of investments which are designed, as far as it is possible to do so, to deal over the long term with the volatility that we expect to happen in capital markets, of which now is an obvious example. We invest across a wide range of asset classes. We try and make sure within those asset classes that there is diversity of both geography, of industry, and so forth. And we have some assets which we would expect to move counter-cyclically. In other words, if the world is going through a particularly strong period of uncertainty, we would expect some assets to perform better than others precisely to sort of balance that. There is no way of avoiding this volatility altogether. I mean, the world is a particularly uncertain place at the moment, and therefore we do expect to see asset volatility, and we have seen that. The biggest issue for us in many ways is inflation, because obviously in our scheme, we increase the pensions that we pay people by reference to the increase in the index. And if that's high, then overnight we will see a significant increase in the amounts we pay. That's built into our projections over a 20-year period, but obviously over a single-year period, it has a much bigger impact. It would balance out over the 20-year period that we forecast.
Thanks. And moving on perhaps to the future now, what are your priorities for the next 4 years? And also, what do you see as the key risks, and how are the ways in which you're looking to manage those risks?
So perhaps I can deal with the priorities first, and I'm not sure I've got these in any particular order, but perhaps I could just cover them off. The starting point is, and always has to be, a recognition that our purpose is to pay pensions to people as and when they fall due. I mean, these are, people have worked all their lives for these. They have a right to receive the pension. So that's always going to be our starting point. And also, we also have a statutory responsibility to try and make sure that we keep our contributions for our employers as stable as possible. And we think that's a key. This is public money, and if they're spending money on pensions, they can't spend money on other things. So we think that's a really important aspect for us. But within that context, I suppose the key priorities, as I say, in no particular order, we've been looking for some time to run a process of overhauling our board papers and processes with a view to trying to restructure our board to get much more of what we do into the public domain, to get the papers much more efficient and much more streamlined, with a view to being able to be much more transparent and efficient in what we do, because we're very keen to get there. You've previously raised the suggestion that we might broadcast our meetings. There's no fundamental objection to that, certainly not from me. I would observe that, unlike, if you'll forgive me, most of the Assembly members, my board are not made up in the main of elected councillors, and therefore they're not used to having their meetings broadcast. One of the only questions is to try and make sure that people will continue to feel comfortable that if they're being broadcast, they won't in some way inhibit the conversation and inhibit their... That doesn't mean to say we won't do it. It's one of the factors we're thinking about how we do these things. There will always be some elements that require us to do this behind closed doors, but we're very keen that they should be reduced to the minimum possible, and so we'd be able to get much more transparent. We wanted to do that last year. It's not a great excuse, but unfortunately it's true that we lost our head of company secretarial last year. They were very, very good. They were offered basically a 50% salary increase to move to the private sector, and that's just not something we could compete with. It meant that a number of things that we were looking to do last year had to be put on hold. We've now recruited a really good replacement for that, so this is something which is beginning to gather momentum again. So that's one of the key priorities for me. I think we want to continue to use our influence to encourage LPPA to continue to improve its services to members and other stakeholders, to make sure that we're providing both a high quality and a cost-effective service to all of our members and stakeholders. That's clearly a key aspect. I think we want to continue to seek opportunities to collaborate and work with other funds. I mean, we do see collaboration and efficiency within LGPS as something that we believe in more strongly. I mean, we have moved further on pooling than just about any other LGPS fund. We really believe in this. We believe in outsourcing investment management to expert individuals who really have the expertise to do this. And we believe that by working with other funds, London Fund's one example, but there are many others, we can achieve and work with others to achieve greater efficiencies and benefits for London as a whole. We want to continue to be strong proponents of responsible investment in general and ensure we meet our net zero targets over time. And we're really keen to do that. And we are we're just in the process of updating our ICAP to see whether those targets still remain appropriate. I'm sure we'll talk about where we are on the existing targets, but do we want to go even further than some of that? These are things that we want to start thinking about. We want to continue to enhance our services to the employers in our fund. One example is, I don't know whether this is possible, but we are going to give some thought over the next 15 months before our next triennial valuation as to whether it's feasible or even desirable to have the possibility of different strategic asset allocation for different types of employers. I mean, we're unusual as an administering authority. Unlike most administering authorities, we don't have one dominant employer in our fund. I mean, most administering authorities, Leicestershire County Council, for example, the county will be the massive proportion of the fund. Although the GLA is our largest employer, it's not anywhere near as dominant a proponent. We've got 120 employers, a number of whom are much smaller and are actually in very different funding positions. And they would welcome, I think, from some of the communication we've had with them, an opportunity to invest in a slightly different way than the rest of the fund. There are other funds that have done this, but it's quite difficult, and we're going to look at whether that's possible or desirable or beneficial for us over the course of the next 15 months. I'm very keen that I and my colleagues on the board should continue to support our Chief Executive and his executive team in continuing both to recruit, retain and develop our people and to maintain what I currently believe we have, which is an open and inclusive culture. I think that's an important aspect for any organisation. I want to ensure that we have a team with the resources and the resilience to meet the regulatory and operational challenges as they arise, including finalising our target operating model. We want to do that after we've recruited our Chief Operating Officer, because that's clearly a key aspect of that. But that's a relatively long list of priorities, but you can see that there's a lot going on, and I think all of those are relevant.
Thanks, John. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned there. One of those is on targets. So firstly, asking whether you're confident that the returns target of CPI plus 3.6% is achievable.
Yes, but you have to recognise that that's over a long period of time, if you see what I mean. So is it achievable in the current year with inflation running at these terms? That's quite a challenge. But that's not the test we set ourselves. The test we set ourselves is achievable over a long period of time. And we're comfortable at the moment that, yes, it is. And
how would you define a long period of time?
Oh, well, we do it in two ways. I mean, obviously, The period we look at is over a 20-year period, but we have an opportunity to look at this in more detail and reassess the position every 3 years. So we will look at this again in more detail at the end of March 2025. That's when we will reassess whether the assumptions we made 2 years ago remain valid, or whether we need to rethink about this. But at the moment, we think that it's still achievable.
Okay, thanks. And the other thing that there was mentioned, one of the recommendations from the GLA Oversight report. We're going to get more detailed into the recommendations later, but I wonder if you could just perhaps tell us how you went through the process of evaluating those recommendations and considering those recommendations.
Well, I sort of feel a little bit about that in the same way in which I felt about sort of internal control reports. I mean, we see these things as positive, and therefore we look very carefully at every recommendation. Some of them, of course, are not ones that are entirely within our control, if you see what I mean. So it involves other people. So, for example, we would love to have more people invest in the London Fund. We've been working hard at that in collaboration with the LSIV. With some terrific work by the LSIV, we've now got 2 other funds that are investing. But outside of those, we look very seriously at all of the recommendations. And those that we haven't yet been able to implement, we'll continue to think about how we can. The transparency I was talking about earlier is a really good example.
John, I think, like I say, there might be some more detailed questions for you on that later in the session. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. John, you talked earlier when you were talking about your investments, you talked about a diversity of geography in investments, but of course we were encouraging you in our recommendations to look at how you could be investing in London-based companies and investments. Are you looking to increase the number of investments in London?
So, I mean, just to try and put this into some sort of context, if you look at equities, for example, which is perhaps not actually the best test here, about 6% of our equities are in the UK, and almost by definition, most of those public equities I'm talking about, almost by definition, all of those will be in London-based companies, because that's where, that's where they're listed. Well, that doesn't mean to say that's where their operations are, but that's where they're listed. I'm not sure that's necessarily a terribly good measure, if you see what I mean. The areas where I think it's most relevant are in the areas of infrastructure and real estate.
Completely.
Roughly 12.5% of our assets are in infrastructure. Roughly 9.5% of our assets are in real estate. So it's about 23% of our assets. We've been doing an exercise with the Good Economy Project to try and identify what proportion of those assets are actually in London and in other parts of the country. We haven't finalised those results yet, so I can't swear that this is going to be the final numbers, but based on what we've got at the moment, it looks like something like 27 to 30% of those assets are in London, and about similar sorts of proportions are in the sort of south and the east of the country. If you take those proportions together, it means that about 6 to 7% of our total assets are currently in London. We don't have a specific, outside of the London Fund, which obviously is designed to do that, we can carry to that, we don't have a specific target that says we're looking at London in particular, but we would expect over time that as the opportunities arise, we will want to take them. I mean, the London Fund is a great example. Our starting point is always, does a potential investment achieve the necessary investment return that we require on a diversified portfolio? So they don't all have to do the same thing. But once you've achieved that, the approach of the London Fund is to say, if the investment achieves the right return, if it can also produce a benefit to the people of London, then why on earth wouldn't we do it? And that was the point. And that's the way in which we think about these things. We're always going to try and make sure that it has to be in conjunction with our strategy and the investment and ensuring we have diversity. But within those constraints, yes, if there are opportunities, we will take them.
We'll take them. Let's talk about the London Fund then. So I saw yesterday that Kingston and Sutton boroughs have announced they're jointly investing 55 million in the London Fund. We know Haringey had already invested. So what progress are you making trying to encourage other London boroughs to invest in this specific fund, and are more to follow given we've just had 2 join yesterday?
It is a challenge in the sense that obviously these are funds that are not part of the LPFA. They're part of, in a pooling sense, they're part of the LSIV, the London Collective Investment Vehicle. And the London Fund is a collaboration between LPPI, our investment managers, and LSIV. So without in any way putting them on the spot, it's primarily the role of LSIV to try and encourage their members to do that. Obviously, whenever we talk to boroughs, it's something that we bring up and try and encourage them to do these things. But it's primarily LSIV. I know they've been working really hard on this. Obviously, it's a question for each borough to determine whether this fits within their priorities and whether that's something they would like to do. It's something that, as with so many things, we hope that what we're building is a coalition of the willing, if you see what I mean. You know, the fact that we've had 2 more boroughs join, we hope that what that will do is start to encourage other people to say, okay, well, maybe this is a good idea, and there might be ways in which... But what it does mean, and this is always going to be a challenge for any councillor, is they're putting money in a London fund, and although that will be an investment in London, it may not be an investment in their particular borough.
Yeah.
And that's always going to be a question which I understand any councillor is going to have to think about.
Yeah, but the more London boroughs are part of this, the more ultimately there probably will be investment in their borough. And
exactly.
And
I mean, that has to be the argument. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, lovely. And in terms of, obviously, I think we were told back in May last year that high-level discussions were underway with the Mayor regarding him supporting the promotion of the London Fund to the boroughs. Where are we with the Mayor advocating this and supporting this?
Well, I mean, obviously it's for the Mayor to comment on what he's doing and what his team are doing. What I can say, though, is that we have regular meetings and discussions with the Mayor's team, and we know that they are highly supportive, both in principle and in activity, in promoting this and trying to encourage boroughs to do that. I mean, it's in everybody's interest. We think it's in everybody's interest that we should do this, so we know that that's part of what their process is.
And how often do you personally meet the Mayor himself?
The Mayor individually, probably not all that often. I mean, I would guess on average about once a year or so that I meet him. But I meet his
Chief of Staff,
yes, and the Deputy Mayor for the Environment, particularly on a regular basis. Chief Investment Officer, who is our main contact, Luke Webster, who I think appeared before this committee. We meet with him formally and informally on a relatively regular basis. Often that's my chief executive rather than me, if you see what I mean.
Course.
But yes, no, it's a fairly regular communication for as you would perhaps expect.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And thinking about the London Fund, actually one of the big issues facing all Londoners is the housing crisis and housing issues. Are there any key achievements in this area of housing with the London Fund, and are there any plans for the future there? I mean, you talked earlier about investing in real estate. Yes,
I mean, there's a couple of examples. I mean, the one in many ways, I don't know why I'm particularly proud of this one, but I just am. The London Fund is heavily involved in the regeneration of Shepherd's Bush Market.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And that has a significant element of housing in it. There's some affordable homes in there, perhaps not as many as we'd like, because there's more, I think, to be done. But the feedback we're getting from the stallholders and the people around there has been really incredibly positive. We had a sort of walk around there. I wasn't able to go, but a number of my colleagues did, and the feedback they gave was just how excited people around there were about what was going on. So there's another housing development that we're investing money in. I think there is more that could be done. I come back to what I said a little while ago. We have to start from the position that we need a suitable investment return, if you see what I mean. But within that constraint, I think there might be opportunities for local authorities, councils, pension funds and central government to think about whether there are ways in which the capital we have could be provided to do that, but we'd need some sort of mechanism to make sure that we could achieve the sort of returns that we need. Yeah. But we're keen to explore whether there are things that could be done in that space.
Generally, housing in London is is and has been a good investment.
Yes.
So property in London in general. Finally, from me, we recommended that you have discussions with Transport for London about whether they might invest in the London Fund. Just wondering what progress you've made there.
So we have reached out, obviously. Clearly this is a matter for TfL and I can't speak for them. My understanding at the moment is that this doesn't fit within their investment priorities, but we will continue to engage with them as and when we can to try and see if we can encourage investment.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
Just a little more on housing investment. It's long been recognised that there's quite a potential for institutional investment in build to rent. And has the LPFA done any work specifically with build to rent investments, because they're the kind of thing that can guarantee a return in the future?
I should be clear that, of course, it wouldn't be us that was doing it. It will be LPPI on our behalf. I know you appreciate that. The short answer is yes, it's something that is always going to be looked at as part of a sort of balanced and diversified portfolio. But each individual asset is something, or investment opportunity is something that LPPI will look at as part of that overall investment portfolio. I mean, to put this in context, I mentioned earlier that about just over 12% of our assets are in real estate. About 95% of that is in the UK. And I think the other 5% is in the Republic of Ireland. So this is a very UK-based real estate portfolio. At the moment, I think it's probably predominated towards commercial markets, but I think there is more that can be done in the sort of build to rent space. I think we need to think about how we can be more confident about the returns over a period of time. But yes, I think there are always opportunities, and I know that LPPI will always look at them.
Yeah, I'm just curious, because we've been talking about this on the Assembly for forever, about how build to rent is not as common in the UK as it is in other countries in Europe. All the figures stack up as a good investment for the future, but there just doesn't seem to be that real big impetus. I mean, you can point to individual examples such as over in Stratford on the Olympic Park and places like that, but it hasn't really gripped the investors as it has done in other countries. What do you think it's missing? Recognising that you're only one of the investors in the take part.
I was going to say, speaking purely personally, I think that if there was some sort of coordinated approach between pension funds, local authorities and government, I hate to use the word public finance initiative because it's become almost a discredited term. And I'm not recommending anything like we had before, but the possibility, and this is only me sort of speaking personally, the possibility of saying, well, you wouldn't need to get... One of the problems with the private finance initiative, in my view, was that actually the returns that people were expecting were just too high. And that's why the whole thing became, frankly, discredited. If we were dealing with pension funds which have clear objectives as to what they're trying to achieve, they're not trying to generate a profit or so forth, they're just trying to make sure that they get the right investment return to pay their pensions. If you could have the sort of structure where the pension fund provided capital, local authorities then rented the buildings from them with some sort of government intervention or guarantee to make sure that the required investment return was going to be arrived. All of this requires a great deal more thought, and I'm not suggesting that that's the right answer or even a valid answer, but I just think that there is more work that could be done collaboratively between the various bodies I'm talking about to see whether more could be done in this space.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. And John, just wanted to go back quickly to something you were discussing with Assembly Member Pigeon around the recommendations around TfL. I think it's disappointing that the London Fund isn't in their future plans. I mean, is there anything more we can do as a GLA or from the Mayor to shout about the London Fund and perhaps convince GLA bodies that they should be making some investment in the London Fund?
I mean, just to be clear, I can't say whether it's in their future plans or not, and I didn't mean in any way to to suggest that. All I'm saying is up until now it hasn't been something that they felt that they wanted to do. Whether it's in their future plans or not clearly will be a matter for TfL. But if there is, I mean, the short answer, frankly, is that each of you as Assembly members have connections both across London and individually, and if within those connections you can encourage people, well, frankly, I think that would be very helpful to everybody. So if it's not impertinent, I would encourage you to do that.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. So I'm going to be looking at more at the sort of ESG side of things. First question, is the LPFA on track to achieve the 6 net zero goals that it has set out in its Climate Investor Action Plan?
The short answer is yes, and I'm really encouraged with where we're going. And if I may, I'll just briefly take you through where we are. Mm-hmm. So our first target was to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 from our 2019 base. I'm thrilled to say we've achieved that. We're there. I'm sure the next question will be, well, why don't you set a tougher target? And we will think about that. So, but that's a perfectly reasonable question. And we are thinking about that. But we are very pleased with the progress we've been able to make on that. We are maintaining an implied temperature rise consistent with the Paris Agreement. We're currently at 1.7% as compared to the 2% target. We have a target of aligning 32% of our material investments with the net zero targets by 2025. We're currently at 29%, so we've got a further 3% to go over the next year or so, and we're confident we're going to do that. We had a target to have 70% of our financed emissions aligned with net zero or subject to engagement by 2025, I think, and we're already at 72%, so we're just over the target for that one. We haven't yet, and these are the remaining two, we haven't yet set a target for climate solutions. The reason for that is that we were waiting for a definition of what a climate solution target should be. The IIGCC published that suggested definition in November of last year, and so since November of last year we've been working on defining what our own climate solutions target should be, and we'll publish that in the near future. The most difficult one for us, frankly, is our own operational emissions. And again, without making the excuse, that's really not within our control at the moment, whilst we remain tenants of the Fire Brigade headquarters in Union Street, because that's not our building. We can't do as much about it as we would like. Over the next couple of years, we will be moving out of that building, and we will be therefore obviously looking at a new building, which hopefully will make it much easier for us to get to our operational target. But that one is the most difficult one for us at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So broadly, so you've kind of given a rosy picture of meeting these targets, but as you have said yourself, you're looking at how to increase those targets to make them more challenging, because if you're meeting everything so quickly, then that suggests that actually it could be possible to go much further. Now, you said back at the beginning to Assembly Member Best that there wasn't really anything keeping you up at night at the moment, but I think something that should be keeping us all up at night is the way that we're seeing these increasingly extreme weather events around the world impacting people's everyday lives. And certainly at the moment, there's a lot of people in this country who are experiencing the sort of fallout from flooding and the sort of misery that causes, the sort of cleaning up the silt and everything else, and drying out your home. And that has huge economic impact. And all the suggestions are that this is something that we should be expecting more of. So the pensions fund is a really powerful lever in terms of encouraging the kind of activity that actually makes us more resilient to this kind of changing environment that we're in. So we've got a kind of, you mentioned earlier, the kind of financially kind of turbulent situation, but we're also experiencing a sort of turbulence just in the everyday normality of what our weather is like and what, you know, how our world functions. So do you think that there is more that you could be doing? Like, for instance, the Mayor is doing climate budgeting, where they're drilling down into Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. It's challenging, it's hard. They've had to row back on doing Scope 3 emissions for next year. They've said they're not going to be able to do that, but they're really working hard at dealing with their Scope 1 and their Scope 2 emissions. Do you think that the LPFA could be, you know, looking at and learning from, say, the climate budgeting processes that the Mayor is involved in, which the City of Oslo has been leading on across the world, to really try and embed the right incentives for investment, so that the projects that can really make a difference and make us a more resilient society get the investment they need?
So just a couple of points of clarification before I start. So I think I have to say, it's almost impossible to win in these circumstances, isn't it? So if you achieve the targets, then people will never turn around and say, well, obviously the targets are too easy and so forth. I genuinely don't believe that's a fair challenge. I understand why you say it, but actually I think we did set stretch targets, and I think it's hugely, I mean, I can't claim any personal credit for this, so I'm very happy to say I think it's hugely to the credit of LPPI and the people who manage our investments that we've actually made the progress we have, because I don't think they were easy targets, and I don't think achieving them has been in any way easy. I mean, you know, one example is that we have divested fully from fossil fuel investments, for example, and that was, you know, something that has been significant. So if you'll forgive me, I wouldn't accept the challenge that they're easy targets, and therefore, but does that mean that we can't go further? No, of course we can think about whether we should and can go further, but we, you know, one of the challenges and one of the things that we will be looking at doing over the course of the next few years is actually to extend the range of assets where we have the necessary data and control to actually measure and therefore start to reduce emissions from them. So at the moment, you know, we do this primarily for public equities, but we want to do it for real estate where we don't have clear measures yet, and we're moving at that. We want to do it for corporate bonds where there aren't clear measures. So that's part of where I think we can continue to improve by expanding the way in which we look at these things. Is there more that we can do? Well, there's always more that can be done. I think the key point from our perspective is that we continue to encourage LPPI on our behalf to ensure that they have embedded ESG principles into every aspect of their investment decision-making process, and we believe that's what they do. We know they take this very seriously. They have their own responsible investment team, but at the same time, as part of our commitment to this, we have over the last 15 months or so recruited our own responsible investment manager who looks at things obviously from a very different perspective from LPPI, to try and encourage us to think about the sorts of activities and possibilities that we've got. Are there more things we could do? Because we're continuing to do that. And I suppose that brings me back to the other point I just wanted to mention, which is, and I know you meant this in the right way, and I took it in the right way, but when I said that there weren't things that were keeping me up at night, I meant in my capacity as chair of the LPPA. There's all sorts of things that are keeping me up at night as a citizen. And, you know, those are the sorts of things you've mentioned. And, you know, I'm delighted that I can say with certainty that the sorts of things you're talking about are key concerns of every member of my board. I mean, everybody who sits on my board, if they were sitting here, would be saying the same sort of things I am in terms of our commitment to address some of these responsible investment challenges in general, but obviously the climate change emergency in particular.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned the operational emissions reduction goal. Is that one that you were, no, which was the one you haven't set?
The operational emissions, that's our own.
It was the climate solutions goal,
which
is
we
the
haven't
one
done yet.
That you haven't yet set. Do you have a time scale when you think you may be able to?
We're working on it now, so we would hope to be able to publish something. I'm not going to give you an absolute deadline, but in the comparatively near future.
Okay.
And we will publish it. As we have as you may have seen, we actually have a net zero hub on our website. So we're trying to keep everybody informed of what we're doing on a real-time basis. So as soon as we've got it, we will publish it.
Okay. So you said you've divested all extractive fossil fuel holdings in the global equity portfolio, I think that is. Do you hold any extractive fossil fuel investments in any other part of the fund?
The honest answer is I don't know specifically. I don't believe so, but I can look into that and check that. We do get feedback as often as we can, but I'm very happy to look into that. And
if you could, that would be helpful, and send that information to the committee.
Yes, no, happy to do that.
Thank you. Now, have you had any discussions as the LPFA with the Mayor, as recommended in the committee's pensions review report under recommendation 9, regarding the LPFA clarifying how and when it would use its power to request that local pensions partnership investment, so LPPI, considers non-financial factors in individual investment decisions?
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of points on that particular recommendation. The first one is, of course, that in practice, it's unlikely that we would ever be faced with that decision because, of course, these are individual investment decisions and we don't make those individual investment decisions. LPPI do on our behalf. It's for us to sort of set their policy and strategy. Secondly, and perhaps far more significantly, if you'll forgive me, I'm not convinced that those are valid differences. I mean, it sort of implies that there is a difference between fiduciary duty and producing investment return and making responsible investments. One of the huge advantages we feel of being very long-term investors is that we're able to recognise that all the evidence is that over a long-term period, responsible investment in all the things that we would all recognise as responsible investment, companies that operate on other assets which operate on the basis of responsible policies and so forth, produce better returns. So actually, over the long term, we don't actually see those things as being in conflict. We actually think that if you embed responsible investment policies into your decision-making policy, then it will produce the right level of fiduciary returns over time. But having said all that, I think the London Fund is a really good example of not doing something instead of investment return. It's actually doing something which is demonstrating my point of doing both. We started with the principle of saying we wanted to achieve the right level of investment return within our diversified portfolio and so forth. But if at the same time we can find an investment which actually benefits Londoners, then we will do it. That's exactly the sort of example where I don't think we're choosing between these two things. I think it's possible to do both things at the same time.
So you just don't you don't see that I mean, because I think there was we got a response that had talked about the risk of politicising upfront sort of investment in infrastructure and real estate. So that sort of suggests that there's a sort of hesitancy about investing in some of the things that might be not delivering an immediate financial.
Forgive me, I don't know if that perhaps we weren't as clear as we should have been. I think all we were trying to say, and all I'm trying to say, is that we would be hesitant if somebody were to come to us and say, never mind the investment return, we think you should be investing in this because it's a good thing. We would resist that because, as I said earlier, our primary purpose is to make sure we pay pensions, and therefore we will always address everything from the perspective of does it have the right investment return. But within those, so that's, I think, what we're talking about in terms of sort of politicalisation. If somebody turn around, and there is some talk at the moment, for example, and I don't want to get into any political issues, but there is a lot of debate at the moment about whether pension funds should be required to invest in certain types of assets. Although I think we actually do meet the criteria that the government is currently talking about, and this isn't a government or party point, I think personally, I think that sort of thing would be unhelpful. I think there are all sorts of reasons we can go into why I don't think that would be helpful. But that doesn't mean to say that if the opportunities are the right ones, we wouldn't invest in them. And that's exactly what I think we do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We've had indications for a couple of supplementaries. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. I currently chair the Assembly's Environment Committee, so looking at these sort of longer term targets is something we do across a whole series of different areas. You've obviously got your 6 net zero goals, but thinking about breaking those down and not just pushing things off to 2030, 2035 or 2040, have you thought about having interim goals so that you've got something to aim for that's sooner, so that you can track to see if you're on, making sufficient progress en route to a 2030 or a 2035 or a 2040 goal? For example, in your portfolio emissions reduction goals, emission-related reduction goals, you've got a target for 75% reduction by 2030. Have you thought about having a target of 2027 and having achieved something by then?
Well, I think in that particular case we've achieved the target already, so I think it's more a question of thinking about whether there's a
so
further
is there a
target.
New stretching target?
Yes, and this is part of the thing we're thinking about, to say, as I say, I'm slightly sensitive to the suggestion that these were easy targets in the first place, because I don't think that's fair. But does that mean that having been more successful than we thought we might be, we could do more? Of course, that's the sort of thing that we will continue to think about. A number of these targets are actually interim targets in themselves, if you see what I mean. So, for example, I mentioned that we've got a target of aligning 32% of our material investment by 2025. That is itself an interim target. We have dates, which I now can't remember off the top of my head, to get to 55% and then 70%. So these are themselves interim targets. But I think the broader point is, if we're achieving these things faster than we thought, we don't want to rest on our laurels. We want to continue to think about whether there is more we could do, and whether, therefore, we can help even further with moving towards the net zero target. And without in any way moving away from the climate emergency, I think it is important to re-emphasise that whilst we think it's obviously the single most urgent issue that's facing us, we do think responsible investment and all the other aspects of that, so fair pay, just transition, diversity and equality, all of these are areas where we think it's important too that the companies and assets in which we invest should have policies which are responsible in that sort of way as well. And we continue to focus on all of those areas.
Well, I think just transition is obviously very closely related to climate. In any case, I just wanted to come back to your net zero goal 3 and the climate solutions, which you said you sort of backed away from because it wasn't quite clear what they were. What kind of things do you think you might be looking at now to invest in? Because I do think there are a range of things that are coming forward as more or less obvious solutions, some more obvious than others, if you like. Would you be looking to invest more, if, for example, in, and it has again been a slightly fraught discussion, but for example, onshore wind, which if you do install onshore wind, has a very quick payback period, and then you start to get a very significant return on your investment over very many years. The turbines are then up. Is that the kind of thing that you would be investing in, or would it be something like carbon capture and storage? I'm slightly trying to think what the return on investment from carbon capture and storage might be, but perhaps someone can tell me.
Well, again, forgive me. I didn't.
No.
A couple of points on that. I suppose the starting point, and I'm sorry to keep saying this, but of course we don't make those individual investment decisions. LPPI do on our behalf. But obviously we do have conversations with them and
I was going to
encourage
say,
that.
you talk to them though.
We do, yes, no, absolutely. I'm just saying it's not, these aren't ultimately our decisions, if
No.
you see what I mean. And that's the way we choose to do it. We do get regular reports on the investments we're making in what we're calling green technologies. So we have sort of brown technologies and green technologies. And I'm pleased to say that the proportion of investments we have in genuine green technologies continues to rise, and that's something we continue to monitor. We are So one of the joint ventures that LPPI is heavily involved in is GLA, which is an infrastructure partnership with a number of other LGPS funds, including Greater Manchester and so forth. They've got about £2.5 billion worth under management. They are, I believe, the largest investor in offshore wind farms in the UK. Now that's offshore, but it's a clear evidence of the sort of area of investments that they want to think about. So I have no doubt that this sort of thing is exactly one of the areas that they will continue to think about, and whether there are other opportunities in the true green space for us to invest in.
And could that potentially also, which we've completely underexploited despite being rather obviously an island, we've done very little to exploit tidal energy. Is that the kind of thing that might be under discussion as well?
The short answer is I don't know exactly what they're looking at, but I would be surprised if there are viable investment opportunities in those space. They would consider all of them.
Would you be able to update us perhaps after when you do decide what your investments in climate solutions is likely to be? Is that something you're saying you're likely to be coming forward with that quite soon?
I think there's two separate aspects here. There's setting our target and then actually thinking about what the precise investments are going to be. I could certainly do the former. I don't think, in all honesty, without in any way trying to be unhelpful, I can do the latter, because that will be a much longer process of LPPI considering these things and opportunities as they arise. So if I sort of said, well, we're going to look to invest in this, there may be no opportunities for that. What I will do is we will obviously be happy to let you know significant investments that we do make, if that would be of interest.
I think it would be, and let's hope LPPI don't take too long to make decisions, because I think there are other people clamouring to invest in some of these technologies because they can see that the ROI is going to be very good on some of them in the years ahead. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
What has been the financial impact of divesting from fossil fuels?
So I'm hesitating. I'm not entirely sure I know how to answer that question, because I'm not sure what the comparator would be, if you see what I mean. All I can say is that if you... I'm always very hesitant to talk about investment performance in the short term, because investment performance in the short term is exactly that. It's investment performance in the short term, and I spent a long time this morning talking about how we're a long-term investor. As a question of fact, the PERC tables, which are the tables which about 60 of the 85 LGPS funds contribute their data to, it's a snapshot. I'm not sure how perfect the data is and so forth, but it's one of the few things we've got. That indicated that actually LPPI's performance for us last year was the best of all of the funds in PERC. Now, that was 1 year snapshot. If it wouldn't be the same.
What is that list? I'm not taking.
There is a list of the investment performance of about 60 of the LGPS pension funds.
Okay.
And that now, I really do not want to make too much of that, because it was a snapshot, and if you did it over a longer period, if you took the position 3 years ago, when sadly Ukraine was invaded, in that particular year, of course, the oil price shot up, and in that particular year, oil stocks did particularly well. So the performance 3 years ago for that year was probably was less impressive. But we don't look at it that way. We look at it over a long period of time, and over a long period of time, we don't believe that these assets are likely to be strong performing. Therefore, we don't hold them. I mean, it's as simple as that.
So, cutting to the chase, are LPFA members likely to have less or more as a result of the divestment?
Well, our expectation,
or more?
Our expectation is that they would be better off, because what we're saying is that over the long period, we don't think these will be strong investments, and therefore we think it will be to members' benefit not to hold it. But we didn't do it for altruistic reasons, if you see what I mean. I mean, this was an investment decision that was made by LPPI based on, obviously, our discussions with them about what is a good long-term investment, and they didn't feel they were good long-term investments.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair. My questions are on governance, and I'd like to return. You talked right up front about the internal audit that we received yesterday. So I wonder whether you could run us through what that said in terms of actions for you and what rating it gave to the LPF.
So the rating it gave was reasonable assurance, which is obviously an improvement from where we were last year, which we were very pleased with. I go back to what I said a little while ago, that it is important to put these things in context. This is about helping us, if you see what I mean, and we see it in that sort of context. To go back to the previous report, which obviously was the subject of the previous committee hearing you had with Robert Branner and Peter. At that stage, we had 21 areas that we were looking at. 19 of them had been concluded by the time we wrote to you last year. Of the remaining 2, one was completed last year, and the one we've just talked about is continuing. We will, continue to try and see if we can enhance our overall governance to improve our internal control procedures. I emphasise, I don't believe there's anything that is actually going wrong at the moment. This is about how can we make it stronger. So one of the examples is that we will look over the course of the next year at our cybersecurity areas and about the efficiency of our IT security. That's obviously a key area. We haven't done that this year because frankly, with LPPA going through the system processes it has, we didn't think it would be helpful to try and do that at the same time, but that's now an area of focus that we'll be able to focus on. Succession planning, I've already mentioned, is something we're going to do. But just to put this in context, over the course of the last year or so, as part of sort of strengthening our mid-management of governance, we've recruited a legal officer, we've got a new head of compliance, we've got a new pensions and risk governance manager, we've got a new compliance manager. I mean, all these are areas where we believe we're adding to our resilience over our own governance and control process. So we're quite optimistic about the future, but obviously, as with any small organisation, there's always more you could do, and you have to be realistic about what's achievable.
Sure, understood. So in terms of this, the most recent internal audit report, so you've outlined various actions, some of which have obviously been ongoing for some time. Obviously, the actions from the 2021.
But I'm sorry, I did also. I'm sorry to interrupt. I did also pick up on the ones that came out of this year's report.
Yes, no, absolutely. With succession planning. Yes, yeah, absolutely. You did talk about that. So there's also. Is there any other actions that you're taking as a result of this report specifically? Was there anything that came out of it that wasn't something you were already working on?
No. There's a very dangerous balance here that I sound complacent. I'm not trying to sound that way at all, but all of these are areas where we ask our internal auditors to assess. We assess with them what the right areas to look at should be because we're looking for help in those areas. Yes. So everything that we see from them is helpful and constructive, and we see it as a, thank you for this. That means we can now continue to work on it. But
yeah, understood. It is a process where you work with them. Yeah, correct. No, absolutely. I do understand that. So there's 2 high-risk findings in the internal report. You've talked about succession planning, which is obviously something that's mentioned before. The other one is around a review of the pensions administration strategy, and it was just highlighting that hadn't been reviewed since 2014. Did you?
And that's been completed. So we've done that. We did that in 2023.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's apologies for. Obviously, we did get this just
yesterday.
Yeah,
and as I said last night, I'm really sorry you didn't get that earlier.
That's no problem. Okay, so just going back to the pensions review report, our pensions review report, it did request that an action plan was published detailing how you responded for the 2021-22. Obviously, in this internal report, that we can see that there were loads of actions, and those have now been completed, and you've outlined that. But I'm not sure we were aware of an action plan before we got this this further internal audit, which we only got yesterday. So, can you just talk us through that process? So, what do you think was?
Well, I suppose if I go back to last year, I suppose a couple of points on that. We go back to last year. Of the recommendations from our internal auditors, there were 21 high-risk areas. We'd already done 19 of them. There were 2 more that we've looked at. We have these internal control reports every year. I suppose the way in which we look at this is that the internal control report is itself, if you like, a sort of action plan. It's sort of saying, well, these are the things we would like, we as external experts, I mean, they could well be employed by us, but they just don't happen to be, recommend that you look at. Yes. And that is the action plan. It is, okay, we will then go away and look at these. It is important to emphasise that it won't always be the case that we would necessarily decide fully to implement a recommendation. As I'm sure Assembly members will realise, the role of the internal auditor is to say, well, if you wanted to be best in class effectively, you would do this. But actually, we may well conclude that we don't need to be best in class. It may be that if we're a huge organisation with thousands of people, we can afford to do that. It may be that we decide, I'm not suggesting any of the ones we've had so far are ones we won't do, we will. But it's just that sort of process as we go through.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to get at. So obviously you have the recommendations, which you will then take a look at, and you will then decide what to do about them, and how far to go in terms of those recommendations. So does that form an action plan internally, and is that something that you would publish and share? Because at the moment, I think we just get the internal audit. Well, eventually get. I think
we'd be hesitant about publishing that, to be perfectly honest, because putting something in the public domain which sort of talks about what we're doing to try and address our controls and so forth, almost invites people to say, well, how can we find a way to get round our controls, if you see what I mean? So I'm very happy that we will sort of, as we did, sort of show you the report, and we will sort of happily feedback on how we're addressing those things in subsequent correspondence. I think I'd be hesitant about publishing an action plan to deal with that, because it's not like we're dealing with an external audit which has said you've got something wrong. This is about saying, how are we managing our own internal control processes? And the sort of implication would be that actually we're being held to account for that, and I don't see it that way. This is part of helping management, where we are accountable as if, heaven forbid, anything did go wrong, and then of course we would expect to be held to account. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to make a judgment on behalf of the committee about whether we agreed or not, because obviously it was a recommendation, but thank you for explaining to the committee about that position. My next question is about, obviously previously there were some issues with information security. There was an issue around redaction of documents over the previous internal audit. Can you provide any further detail on the processes that have been put in place to improve those information security arrangements?
Well, I hope that people have actually seen improvements, if you see what I mean, in terms of what we do. So, one of the comments was that we should publish the LPPA reports. We do that, then we now publish those. We are trying, and we had a board discussion about this, and whilst there will always be inevitably some things which have to be redacted, the clear policy that we've adopted is that we will only redact if we absolutely feel it's necessary. So the starting principle, as always, things would be in the public domain if they possibly can be. I mentioned earlier that one of the things we are looking to do over the course of next year is to restructure our board papers and board processes, to think about the way in which our board meetings work, to try and see if there is more and more that we could do in the public domain. I'm sure there is the short answer. Yeah. We haven't been able to do that yet for the reasons I mentioned, but it is a key focus, as I mentioned, of mine over the next year, to try and see if we can revamp those processes and therefore be even more transparent. But I hope people have noticed that we are along the path of trying to be more and more transparent all the time.
That's fine, thanks. The question was actually not about transparency, although I was going to, so thank you for answering that, because I was going to come along to, it was about, because there was a situation where a document had been redacted. It wasn't really a question about whether it should or shouldn't have been redacted, it was that the redaction wasn't working. So has that Has
Yes.
that all been? Are you confident that those processes are now that whether or not we do or don't agree that they should be redacted, that if you choose to redact something, it is redacted?
Yes, I'm comfortable. So essentially, what we've decided as a board is that we will delegate to our chief executive the decision-making power to decide what is and isn't redacted, but with the understanding that redaction should be limited to those cases where it really is necessary. If you see what I mean.
Sorry, could I just help in here, because I think, John, that the point of this is that there was
my misunderstanding.
There was a document which somebody had redacted in Word by blacking over some of the text. Obviously, anyone that is slightly proficient in Word would know that to go in that document, and you just unhighlight that text and remove the black,
Oh, I see.
and you see
I'm
it.
sorry, I misunderstood. So yes, I mean, we are making sure that we can't do that anymore. I'm sorry, I did
So
misunderstand.
it's basically it's an information security thing. Are you confident now? Have those processes been reviewed?
I'm sorry, I did misunderstand, and yes,
No,
we're
that's
confident
fine.
with that. I'm sorry,
We'll
yes.
buy them some Sharpies.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was just
No, you
dumb.
just hold those up to the light.
Yeah,
then.
that fell into the embarrassing category. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
but I mean, obviously that highlighted, it potentially highlighted it because you come across those things by accident.
Yes.
Are you now confident that those processes,
Yes.
in terms of information security, are
Yeah.
reviewed so appropriate action is taken when things do need to be?
As far as we can tell, my understanding is yes, we've now sort of dealt with that sort of issue, and we wouldn't do that again. Yes.
Okay. All right then. And yeah, you've talked about transparency, so I just wanted to return to so basically this is going to be something that you look at over the year, board meetings, papers and everything like that. So just returning to the question about broadcasting meetings online, and you have outlined that, you know, you've got some discussions to do with the board. Is that part of what you're going to look at over the next year, and a sort of decision will be made over that period of time?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Just if I could circle back quickly to your response to the publishing the action plan, and I truly take on board what you said there, but there could perhaps be a step further of perhaps letting this committee know how you intend to respond to some of the actions in a private and confidential letter. And it wouldn't have to be the entire detail, but it could let us know, for example, by when things would be actioned and who that responsibility would sit with.
I'm certainly happy to look at that and see what we can do.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you. I have just a couple of questions for you. So, do you have concerns on the affordability of the scheme arising from the current economic climate?
Well, I'll give the short answer and say no, I don't, but I'll probably try and amplify that. I mean, I think as I mentioned earlier, we are in the fortunate position of being very long-term investors, and therefore we can take a very long-term view of our investment performance and returns. We currently have, we understand, one of the lowest levels of contribution within the LGPS. Certainly significantly lower than you might see in a number of private sector schemes. One of our statutory obligations is to try and make sure that the contributions from our employers are kept as stable as possible, not necessarily as low as possible, as stable as possible. And I think we've been making significant progress in that. So, for example, we do an assessment of the financial strength of all of our employers every 3 years, and we actually assign them what we call a covenant rating, so an indication of how strong we think they are independently, and that enables us to look at, although it is a single fund and we don't actually hold pools for different employers, we are able to try and estimate how much the pool for each individual employer is. At the last valuation, any employer who had a fund which was more than 120% funded, we actually gave them a small reduction in their contribution rate as a result of that. We set a sort of negative secondary contribution, which gave them a small benefit to reflect the fact that they were particularly well funded. We can't guarantee that will be the case. I can't guarantee what the position is going to be in March 25 when we need to do this, because, as you say, the world is incredibly uncertain at the moment. But it is something we focus on all the time, and certainly one of our key objectives is to try and ensure that it does indeed continue to be affordable.
Okay, thank you. My next question, the LPFA wrote to the committee to let the committee know that there are 2,300 members who might be entitled to an increase in their pensions due to the McLeod remedy, and I understand that that came into effect on the 1st of October last year, so it's been slightly over 2 months if you just count Christmas. The committee's pensions report recommended that the LPFA should publish a timeline of plans to quantify the scale of the financial impact of this remedy and publish quarterly updates. And I just wondered if the LPA will implement this particular recommendation from the committee.
So I can't remember where the figure of 2,300 came from. If that's right, I think our current estimate is that around 1% of our membership may be affected by the McLeod judgment, which we think is about 900 people, actually, rather than 2,300 people. I'm sorry if there's a misunderstanding of the number, but we think it's about 900 people. I'll explain why we can't be certain about that in a second. Our estimate is that the total cost of adjustments for the McLeod remedy will be somewhere in the region of £23 million in total over the lifetime of the fund. And without in any way want to sound cavalier about that, that's over a very long period, and we are a £7.7 billion fund. So I want to put this in the context of this. It's obviously very important for the individuals. I have to say, I think it is unlikely that the amount of money on a sort of regular basis will be huge for individuals. I mean, obviously any increase in the current economic climate is important, but I don't want to give the impression that we're making life-changing adjustments. There are a number of elements in adjusting for McLeod. The first one is that we, of course, have to identify all the individuals concerned and make sure that we've got the appropriate data for them. A large part of that requires us to get data from our employers. At the moment, we are running, I think, at about 59% of the data we need having come back from employers. So obviously we're still working with a significant number of employers to get more data and more information. If we can't get the data, or if they haven't got the data, then we will have to make certain assumptions. We'd obviously much rather not do that because, we'd rather be certain we're trying to get this right. The next step is the use of our new administration computer system. The relevant functionality of that system to do the McLeod adjustments actually went live purely by coincidence today. And therefore, we've actually got the systems that we need. If we can get the data right, then we should be able to make progress reasonably quickly. I'm not sure whether we're yet in a position to be able to publish a timeline, but we will certainly continue to look at that, and we're happy to keep people informed as to how we're going.
Okay. Can I just clarify something for myself and for others? So at a previous meeting, in our briefing, it says that the LPFA's Funding and Risk Director told the committee that in terms of the proportion of members that might be affected, again, we have around 20% of our active membership that could be eligible. And I think that was in reference to those over here, to the McLeod judgment. So that...
20% of our active membership. I think that's... I'm sorry, I'd have to check that.
Yeah,
but
no, I'm just asking...
I don't believe that's right. Forgive me if I apologise for the misunderstanding, but I would be 20% of our active membership... Which
is a big number compared to 900 people.
I'd be amazed by that, to be honest. I think it is conceivable that I'm now guessing, it's conceivable that might be a reference to the number of people that LPPA administers who might be affected out of it. So LPPA look after 600,000 people, including a number of blue light organisations, fire, and obviously if they're looking after fire and police services, a large number of them will be affected by the McLeod judgment. So that's the only solution. But if I may, let me check that and I'll come back to you. But I don't believe that's right.
Okay. It might be that the numbers are being funneled down to figure out what the actual number is, but I think the committee it'd be helpful to kind of come back.
I will write to you afterwards and clarify what the actual number is. But as I say, my understanding, and I was speaking about this only yesterday, my understanding is that of LPFA members who will be affected by this, we think it's roughly 1%, so about 900 people, something like that.
Okay, much better than 20. Yeah. And then my final question then, you have touched on it a little bit already, but can you provide an update on the progress made in delivering the McLeod remedy? And, well, the number is now 900, you say. The accuracy of that, I think if you're okay to report back on the accuracy of the numbers, well, but on the progress being made would be really good.
Yes, so I certainly I can't be, at this stage, I can't be completely accurate about the 900 figure because, as I say, we're still missing data from 40% of our employers, and that obviously makes this difficult. But that's certainly the estimate that we've made in conjunction with LPPA and our external actuary and so forth. I think in terms of progress, we are continuing to press. I'm not getting at them at all, but we're continuing to impress our employers who haven't responded to give us the information, and we will continue to work with them both at the LPFA level and at the LPPA level. A lot of our effort has gone into trying to help employers and recognise that this is difficult and can we help them. I think the fact that the functionality has now gone live will enable us to start thinking in much more specific terms about when we think and by when we think we will be able to make these adjustments. So I'm happy to sort of include in the correspondence where we think we're going to get to. But I'm not sure I'm going to be able to publish a clear timeline for it, but we will certainly give you an update on when we expect to make progress and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. And I just want to pick up there. It was the LPFA's Funding and Risk Director, Peter Ballard, that had said that about the 20%.
Yes, no, I heard that. And
also, sorry, just to say, and then that was confirmed in the follow-up letter from the CEO of the LPFA as well, relating to 2,300 members. So I'd really like to understand as quickly as possible why there's been such a...
But as I say, without in any way trying to trivialise this, even at 2,300, the figure I am comfortable about is the estimated cost to us of managing this, if you see what I mean, because obviously one of our prime concerns is to make sure that this is affordable and manageable. But I will certainly come back and clarify where that comes from.
And Assembly Member Cooper, to wrap us up with the last couple of questions.
Thank you. Well, we've just been talking about redacting things, but could you just tell us whether you do have any concerns at all about the performance of the LPPA of any nature that you're happy to disclose?
There's nothing I would only do in private, if you see what I mean. Obviously one of the key areas of oversight of LPPA is our local pensions board, and we do publish the LPB minutes now that they're available.
Yes, that was one of our recommendations from the report last year.
Absolutely, and we do that. So that's sort of part of what I was sort of saying. We're trying to be more transparent and so forth. So there's nothing about LPPA which I haven't already referred to, if you see what I mean. I think there have been clear challenges for them as an organisation as a result, particularly of this new system, but also because, in common with the administration industry as a whole, and this is true private, public sector, LGPS and everywhere, there is a real shortage of staff, and it is a real problem. Retention of staff is difficult, developing staff is difficult, and LPPA have put a huge amount of work and effort into trying to improve their recruitment process, to multi-skill people so that they can actually get promotions and salary increases quicker, that we train people faster to try and deal with some of these challenges. So there's nothing out there which, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm saying this, everything in the garden is rosy, it isn't, but there's nothing out there where I'm sort of going, there's such a fundamental problem that we don't believe that they will get to where we need them to get to.
Okay, so not sort of massive red flags all over everything you're saying.
No.
So coming back to the Universal Pension Management System that was introduced in February 2022, so almost exactly 2 years ago, our understanding from the LPPA website is that it was designed to improve the pension administration experience for employers by simplifying processes and streamlining information. However, our understanding is that the interface for the employees and for the employers who also might want to access things through the portal, My Pension Online being replaced by Pension Point, is that members can no longer view the history of the pension accrual, can no longer view transferred in pensions where people have done that transferring in, including the date and the value of the transfer in. Members can no longer access documents and records relating to their individual correspondence with LPPA. That took place prior to the move to the new portal, and that it's sort of generally less interactive with multiple pages that you have to click through to access pension projections, and a lot of error messages come up. So obviously those are some quite big changes and some problems and issues, and the 21-22 audit sort of flagged some concerns. Are you happy that you feel that this has all sort of moved forwards and some of these problems and issues? And do you think that's an adequate level of information for people to be able to access?
Well, I can't comment on some of the individual points you've made. I'm very happy to sort of look into it and come back to you in more.
I think that would be really helpful because
detail,
I think it's really important. I mean, certainly when I, go through my portal, if I feel there's not enough information, it is quite frustrating, when I'm looking at my own position, and I would imagine it must be quite difficult for either employers or employees if they're having the same kind of issues about the lack of information.
Yeah, I will look at that. That's not the sort of feedback that we're getting on a regular basis, if you see what I'm not saying it's not valid, but it's not the sort of thing that is consistently being raised with us. One of the challenges, for example, I know employers have had is that UPM requires monthly input rather than sort of annual input. And obviously that is, as people get used to that process, it obviously requires some getting used to and everything else. Long term, there's a huge benefit to being able to do that in terms of updated information and everything else. But obviously, people have to get used to that transition as they're going through. So I will happily look at all of those areas. Net, we would expect that as the increased functionality of UPM comes online, I've mentioned one that's coming online today, people will start to see enhanced benefits and service improvements. But obviously I recognise that's sort of stuff that we have to demonstrate in the future as these things come online. But I'll look at those specific points because that's not the sort of regular feedback we're getting, so I need to test it.
We'd be really grateful. Obviously, we've come back to this having done the very detailed look last year over a couple of meetings and come up with a report with that sort of long list of recommendations. And obviously, you updated us where we'd sort of said, well, there's these 9 high-risk areas, and then we'd asked for some more transparency, including the publication of the minutes of the meetings. We also asked if we could, we also recommended rather that the full unredacted LPPA quarterly performance reports should be made available in the, for example, the meeting agenda packs for the meetings. Is that something LPFA has decided to implement?
We're doing it. So the LPPA reports are already published, so we do them.
Great. So we are seeing the performance reports as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. That draws to an end our Q&A session with John. So thank you today, John, for answering our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report as background to put in questions to the invited guests and note the subsequent discussion? And can I ask you all to delegate authority to the chairman in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Thank you. Right, we're going to take a short adjournment to change panels and get some mics that are a bit dodgy swapped around apparently. So can we all be back here by 11:45? Apart from John, you don't have to come back unless you
Thank you
feel
very
like
much indeed. Good to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Il. Welcome back to our second part of today's Oversight Committee, and I would like to welcome, and you might have to shout this out for me because I'm not very good at reading sometimes. So is it Boucher or Boucher? Boucher. I'd like to welcome the Boucher C of E Primary School from Southwark who've come to see us today, so thank you. We're going to be discussing in this next part the GLA's workforce report and making sure that we are employing a workforce that is representative of London and works for you. So, with that in mind, I'd just like to move quickly to item 8, which is the update to the GLA Code of Conduct and its appendices, which has been discussed, I believe, in detail between group leaders and at Bureau, etc. So can I ask the committee to agree to recommend to the London Assembly the draft changes to the Code of Conduct and its appendices as attached at appendices 1 to 5?
You're very diplomatic, Chair, because you said extensively or something. I was going to say debated ad nauseum.
Thank you. Right, moving on to the workforce report, I'd like to welcome Mary Hartley, the Chief Officer, Niran Mufada, Executive Director of Strategy and Communications, Phil Graham, Executive Director of Good Growth, and Beth Cushion, Head of PR. We have read the report. Was there anything you especially wanted to add to it, Mary, or should we go to questions?
I think go straight to questions.
Thank you. I think Assembly Member Cooper, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you. We wouldn't want you to feel that we haven't interrogated you sufficiently on the report. There are differences in turnover between some of the directorates. Why do you think that is? And is that something that's sort of been a permanent difference between those directorates, or is it just something that is different in this specific report? And I'm going to generally address that to you all, and you can then decide between you who is going to reply.
So I don't know for sure, but I would imagine we have consistently over a period of time seen different turnovers in the different directorates, driven by different reasons. Is my main response to you, Assembly Member Cooper. You'll see also in a separate part of the pack that the proportion of fixed term versus permanent posts that we have in the directorates differs, and that too will be a significant driver of churn and turnover too. So I was going to stop there. I was going to see whether our two sort of executive directors sitting on top of directorates wanted to make any further comment.
I can speak from the point of view of good growth, and good growth is broadly typical, I think, in terms of proportion of turnover, but we're the largest directorate in the organisation, so if we're broadly typical, we tend to have the higher numbers of leavers. I think actually to really understand this, you probably need to go a bit lower down even than directorate level, because I think different units, certainly within my directorate, and I think this applies more widely, are playing in very different recruitment markets. It is undoubtedly the case for planning authorities across the capital and indeed across the country, as it is for the planning team in the GLA, that recruitment and retention of planning officers, I can't imagine why this is driving them away.
They've realised there are job opportunities as planners, so they're
getting their CVs in.
They're going to go and train to become planners.
Turnover, 100%.
Yeah. But yeah, planning is an area with particular challenges, has been, and I think those are becoming worse. Equally, on the environment side, a lot of organisations are looking to recruit environment staff at the moment. Net zero, ESG considerations, adaptation, as we see from this week's report, these are all becoming important commercially across the wider public sector, and so there's the recruitment market there we are seeing is very tight. It's more difficult to attract staff, attract good applications, particularly when we're also looking for diverse fields. So, we see some areas where holding on to people, for want of a better way of putting it, is more difficult. There's a market out there, and people are responding to that. We're not seeing the same level of churn across all parts of the unit, of the directorate. I think that will play out differently in different places, but I think it's a good sign, both for me as the Director of Good Growth and for the GLA as a whole, that our overall churn rate is below the wider public sector comparator.
Niran, do you want to add to that?
So a very a similar picture. It will vary across my business units. Where I'm seeing sort of greater levels of churn tend to be in kind of those specialist roles. Because one, we're obviously competing against a workforce where sort of externally where there are jobs and other opportunities, and also as well because with some of the smaller teams, particularly when we look at like our data and our data analysts in City Intelligence, we also have to think about, and this is some work that we are doing now, about career progression, because if you have fairly small teams, actually there's a limitation in terms of kind of career progression. So one of the areas that we I know we're certainly doing work with, particularly around kind of the job families work, is thinking about those career paths and those career pathways, so we can kind of try and retain people within the organisation. But as Phil has said, the picture will vary across the business units. But where I see my greatest churn tend to be in those specialist roles.
Okay. Talking about career paths, it would still seem, and this is something we have discussed before, and obviously we will come back to again if necessary, that black staff are more likely to be in the lower pay grades in the organisation. That still remains the case. Why is that still the case? And would you say that we've made sufficient progress? I don't know whether that's something that Beth wants to come in on. What more progress can we be making?
Yeah, I'm happy to make a start, but then feel free to jump in. So, yes, we have recognised that. I think progression of our Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff is a key focus of our inclusion programme and our overall workforce strategy. There are a number of things that we are doing. We have just this week launched, for example, a new talent programme. Now, that's not specifically a positive action programme. It's for all staff in the GLA, grades 9 and below, but we have ring-fenced 50% of places on that scheme for staff who identify as disabled or who come from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background, and we believe that will help with that internal progression. And there are a number of other things that we are doing through our inclusion programme. I think I would just comment before Niran comes in that we're not where we want to be, but hopefully that you will see in the stats in this report that we are making progress. We're now seeing, I think it's 28% of our SLT, so our most senior leadership team group, come from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. So still some way to go, but we are making progress.
Well, certainly compared to the background population of the borough that we're situated in, that is well under where we should be. But Niran, I'll bring you in now as well.
Yeah, and just to say, in addition to that, and going back to kind of earlier when I talked about kind of specialist roles, one of the things that we have now just recently launched is an apprenticeship for digital and data, and we've been working really closely with Lottie, which is the borough-wide programme, and it's we've actually got a really good diverse mix of people that have just recently joined the organisation, which is really positive because we need to think about how people then can progress into those roles when those roles become vacant. So we need to think about kind of how we do that and the opportunities that we provide people as they come into the organisation.
Yes, I mean, providing those opportunities is great, and I think because we have had those discussions in the workforce reports, and we've also, I think, tried to move away from having lots of people fulfilling roles on short-term contracts or on interim contracts, even if they've not been short-term, and moving towards, if it's a role that's been going on for a certain period of time, actually we really ought to be filling this on a permanent basis, which I think is better for the organisation and better for the people. But I think it's then important for us to monitor the length of time that people are staying, and whilst we do want to make sure that we get good length of stay, it's also good to encourage that progression. Sometimes that means that we need to encourage people to move on to other things outside of the building. Would it be possible for us to get a breakdown in future of the length of stay of staff by directorate, or indeed, as Phil and Nuran were saying, actually it might even be valuable to do that at a sort of, at a team level within those directorates. I don't want to ask for something too onerous, but I think that might be helpful for us all. Do you have that information to hand? I don't know whether you could provide that
Not
easily.
on me immediately, but we can commission it.
Not necessarily this second, but I think that would be helpful, because that would then speak to the issues about hanging on to staff and identifying if there are high areas of turnover, but also making sure that those opportunities are coming up across the piece. Okay, that would be really helpful. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
I hate to start with a compliment. I don't know if Joe McCartney would agree with me, but going back and looking at these monitoring reports in my mind since 2008, I think these are a massive improvement. You're nodding, so I think the move is definitely in the right direction, and we could certainly obsess. I think it's right for Assembly Member Cooper to raise the issue of black people's progress through the organisation. But when you look at the stats, there isn't, you can't argue about 1 or 2%. Otherwise, I'd go on about the lack of presence of white males in the senior leadership team. Because massively underrepresented, may I say. But I'm certainly not going to get on a soapbox about that. So generally speaking, I think the congratulations go, because this is a slow progress over a number of years, but I think you're to be congratulated on that. I want to know what, you've alluded to the reasons for there being more agency workers in the organisation. This must come at a cost to the authority, and I wonder if we've got an estimate of how much that is costing us to use agency rather than permanent staff.
If I can just make a start on this. So we can very easily find out the current cost of our agency workers. Again, not something I've got on me to hand, but we can find that out. The one thing I would say is you're right, sometimes agency workers come at a premium. Sometimes they can represent good value for money. So there's a number of reasons why we may want to bring in agency workers. That may be to staff up when we've got unexpected demand, or to work on short-term projects. It can also be to bring in skills that are expensive to bring in on a permanent basis. So I think I would just caveat it with that there is sometimes a value for money argument that can be made in relation to agency workers, and I'm seeing it just anecdotally in my own team. So I've got a couple of agency workers, exceptionally skilled people with very niche skill sets that are difficult to recruit to on a permanent basis, but more readily available in the contingent labour market. We know we need them for a discrete period of time, and so I think we could look into it, but I would just make that one slight caveat.
That's interesting. That was going to be my next question, whether or not you're sort of employing agency staff on a kind of task and finish basis, which is actually quite reasonable in my view, or whether or not those agency staff are fulfilling permanent roles. Perhaps you can.
I think it is a mix. I think there are some areas, exactly as you say, where either there are short-term pressures, and in a number of parts of my directorate we're facing that at the moment, because we have an election coming up, and there are projects that we're keen to deliver before we reach the pre-election period. Equally, we use agency staff in a number of places to cover recruitment periods, and once you factor in notice periods and so on, recruitment usually takes 4 to 6 months. There are some projects where you can manage that. In other cases, that's quite a significant gap with that resource. And obviously other reasons like parental leave and so on. But there are areas where agency allows us to manage peaks and troughs. Planning is a critical example of that, which is because it's demand responsive. And so we have an arrangement where we have a kind of float of agency staff that can be drawn upon as new pre-application processes are set up, or as appeals come in, or if the run of planning applications gets particularly high. The one other point I'd make about agency staff, which comes back to Assembly Member Cooper's questions, is they have proved to be quite an effective way of bringing new staff from diverse backgrounds into the organisation in some cases, perhaps where people wouldn't apply for a permanent role because of the nature of the criteria and so on. We have been able to employ them through agency contracts and then subsequently bring them into the organisation once they've staffed up and once they've built their experience and their knowledge and so on. So I think there are a number of reasons, exactly as Beth said, why agency staff might be used. I think partly due to the electoral cycle, certainly on my side, it feels like we are hitting a peak at the moment, and I will be looking carefully at whether that reduces once we're past May. But we need to be, there. It's an important part, a bit of the toolbox to enable us to deliver the objectives that we've been set.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thanks very much. And I agree, actually, that agency workers are not the bogey persons that they're sometimes made out to be. But when we get those figures, will those include consultants as well? So those interims who are perhaps working on short-term projects, especially outside of IR35 as well, will those be included?
So to my knowledge, in fact, I can say with confidence, we have no workers outside of IR35 at the moment. We have very few consultants who don't come through READ, our agency, so that should be a pretty complete picture.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. To what extent are people leaving because of the change to the 4 weekly pay? I don't know if you've done some work on that.
So, so first of all, we don't typically report exit survey data in this mid-year report, but we do routinely in our fuller year-long report in the summer. So that data will be included then. We have, in response actually to a request at the Oversight Committee in November, added in a question into our exit survey about 4 weekly pay. So we'll be able to see then whether that is a factor or not.
And what were the other reasons for, I mean, obviously people get better jobs, I can't imagine a better job than working for the GLA, but apparently there are. But were there other reasons for people departing? Is there something that stands out?
So using the data that we provided here, we've showed the categories of leavers in the last 6 months. The majority are resignation. Some are because fixed-term contracts have ended. So in the last 6 months, 12% of those leavers are because of fixed-term contracts coming to an end. As I said, in the exit survey data that we will be presenting in the summer, we drill down a little bit further. So I think at that point we can share some of the themes that fall out of that.
Okay. I had some other questions. I think I'll leave them to the summer because your reply is probably going to be the same on all of them, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Can't see any other hands. So I just wanted to actually, and Beth, you picked this up, but I wanted to thank you for and anyone and everyone in the team that was involved in this and picking up on a lot of the comments we made, both around data and on those exit surveys and including it in the midterm, because that's really important to see the work we've done and the suggestions we've made have been incorporated. And I think actually in terms of the data, that made it really did tell a story, I think, and that really helped understand some of the questions that I know I and other members have asked previously. I think, as Assembly Member Bob said, we will pick it up in the summer, but I am really keen to understand this HR IT shared service and whether it is causing levers, because obviously the main aim of going to the shared service was to save money. And if we are at any point looking like it's causing a high turnover of staff, losing talent, and also the additional costs of recruitment, I think that's something we have to address. But I think, as we've already said, probably something for the summer. But just so you're aware, I think that might be something we want to focus on. With that in mind, can we agree to note the workforce report as set out in Appendix 1? Thank you. And we'll just be 2 seconds. So if you... on the GLA Oversight Committee work plan, can I ask the committee to note its work programme for 23-24? And the date of the next meeting will be on the 28th of February 2024 at 10 a.m. in the chamber. I have no any other urgent business, so this meeting is done.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.